I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today. Amy Bolton is a certified master naturalist and an avid gardener, and she's focused on creating habitats for wildlife, which you'll see in her talk. She has worked in informal science education for more than 20 years, and she participates in citizen science projects, and we're delighted to have her today. Amy, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Colleen, and welcome everybody. Good morning if you're on the East Coast. It is a lovely day here in Virginia. I'm excited to be talking about inviting nature in and creating outdoor spaces that support wildlife. I encourage you to be active during this talk. I'm going to ask some questions of you and ask you to participate at certain points during the talk. So feel free to put your ideas in the chat. It'll be more conversational and more participatory at times. So you'll get that invitation at different points during the talk. So let's get started. As Colleen said, I am a master naturalist, and the Arlington Regional Master Naturalists program, we call ourselves ARMN. It is a Virginia Master Naturalist chapter. It's also managed by the Virginia Cooperative Extension. This chapter of Virginia Master Naturalists is active in Falls Church, Alexandria, and Arlington. And some of the things that we do as Master Naturalists are we restore habitat, we develop and maintain native gardens, we help homeowners create and nurture backyard wildlife sanctuaries in a number of different ways, giving talks like I'm doing today, and also part of a program that I'll talk about a little bit later in the talk. We lead nature programs for things like doing nature walks and talking about the nature that's around us. And we also lead citizen science projects. I'm going to have the website for Arlington Regional Master Naturalists again at the end of the program if this is something that you're interested in pursuing or getting a little bit more information about. All right. So today we're going to talk about why do we invite nature in and what does it mean to invite nature in? Where do I get started if you're interested in inviting nature in? And then, of course, what does it look like to invite nature into your space? Why invite nature in? We are nature's best hope. One of my inspirations is the work of Doug Tallamy, who's an entomologist at the University of Delaware. He's written a number of books and does a lot of popular talks as well as published research on the intersection of plants and insects, and he looks at it from an ecological perspective. This is partly borrowed from some of his work about why we should invite nature in. So parks and preserves are really not enough. In the United States, we talk a lot about national forests and national parks and preserving land as if nature is preserved out there. But 83% of the land in the United States is privately owned. So it's not enough to preserve nature out there. The theory is that we should be preserving or inviting nature in and working together with nature wherever we can. So climate change and habitat destruction are leading to biodiversity loss. Another reason why we need to think about nature and inviting nature in. Inviting nature in is also an opportunity to build community. As I'll talk about in a second, you may have a small yard or you may have a patio, you may have a large yard, but nature doesn't respect boundaries like property boundaries. An insect or a bird isn't going to say, okay, I'm just going to stay in my little plot here. Nature goes between properties. And so this is an opportunity to think about how you and your community can invite nature in. But you start with your own space and then you can build out from there. So there are great opportunities to build community when you think about inviting nature in. I like this quote by John Muir: when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And what I like about this is it reminds us that everything is connected out in nature. And I think of it from a positive perspective that when you're inviting nature in, that means when you plant a plant that a bird or an insect uses as part of their day-to-day life, that's that interconnection. And it can be a positive interconnection. And sometimes I'll talk a little bit about how it can be a negative interconnection, but everything is connected. So the plants that you put in your yard are going to affect the critters that you invite in. We'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like as we go through the presentation. So today I'm going to talk a lot about birds and insects as a way of inviting nature in, mostly because that's what I specialize in as a master naturalist, as well as plants. There are ways, of course, to invite reptiles, amphibians, and mammals as well. Everybody's invited when you invite nature in to your space. When we talk about being inviting as a space, when I imagine this in my mind, this is not what I imagine. It has some elements that are inviting. There is some cover, but mostly it's a lawn, and a lawn is a monoculture, which does not support a lot of wildlife. So there are elements here in this picture where I bet if I went in there, I could find an insect or two. There might be a bird or two. But in terms of inviting nature in, there are certainly elements of this that are not inviting. The monoculture, and also by the looks of this lawn, I don't know whose house this is, it's a stock photo. By the looks of this lawn, it's likely that they use pesticides, and they use for both getting rid of what they would call weeds and also probably pesticides for insects. That's an antithesis to inviting nature in. But let's turn away from this picture and talk about, from a positive perspective, what can we do to invite nature in? Getting started. So there are three things I'm going to talk about in terms of getting started. The first one is embrace the basics. We'll get to know this a little bit more in a second. The second one is getting to know your space. And then also we're going to start simple, and we're going to make a plan for some simple steps you can do to begin to invite nature into your space. Let's embrace the basics. First, I know that a lot of people think that inviting nature in is a complicated thing because nature is complicated. But I think if we went back to our seventh grade environmental science class, if go back in the Wayback Machine for some of us, we would remember that the basics are about food, water, shelter, and a place to raise young. We also need to think about the entire animal life cycle. And then I'm going to talk some more about leaving the leaves. So I like storytelling. Tell a little bit of a story about this picture. The picture on your screen right is a Pandora's Sphinx moth. Unless the picture is credited, these are all pictures that I've taken from my personal property. I'm weeding in my yard, which I do all the time, and got my face down and I'm weeding, and I see this beautiful little caterpillar, and I think, oh, I have to take a picture of this. So I pick it up because I like to take pictures. I'm putting it on a piece of mulch. I'm trying to angle it, and I'm trying to get the light just right so I can get a really nice picture with my iPhone. And if you look closely at the picture, on the left-hand side of the caterpillar, which is the back end of it, if you will, the right-hand side is its front, its head. The back end, there's a red curvy like tail piece. And what that is that's the Sphinx moth telling me it's upset. So that's not normally there. It actually literally emerges from the back of its body and then starts to wave it at you. And that's a signal that you're making it angry, if you will, or disrupting it if you don't want to anthropomorphize it. So I'm taking this picture, and it's taking a long time. And finally, he just whips out his little red tail. And I thought, okay, I've done enough disturbing the caterpillar. But that's what that tail is for. It's a signal to other critters that it is upset. And for some critters, that might make it stop, because that's a warning sign. And that's what I did after I took this picture. I put it back and then I left it alone. So a little bit of natural history about this Pandora's Sphinx moth for you this morning. All right, back to the basics. Food, water, shelter, a place to raise the young. Food comes in a lot of different forms. On the left-hand side, you're seeing some seed heads from Rudbeckia. And leaving seed heads throughout the year is especially important. The seeds on the left-hand side, those attract goldfinches. The picture on the right are berries. These are American beautyberry. I'm usually going to use the common name today. I usually know either one or the other. But if you want to know more about what the plants are, I can tell you more. They're going to be in a list at the end. Seeds and berries are really important for attracting birds and mammals. And fun fact, on the right, American beautyberry, if you grow this plant, you can make jam out of it. And it's pretty interesting tasting. Both of these are native. Almost everything I'm going to talk about today is a native plant. So leave your seed heads up, grow plants that have lots of berries. Also, don't forget about the fact that, especially in the insect world, but also in the bird world, oftentimes young larval stages for insects or young birds will often eat something that's different than the adult. Evolutionarily, that makes sense. You don't want to compete when you're trying to find food. You don't want you as a parent competing with your progeny for food. So oftentimes in the natural world, adults and young will eat different things and different things throughout their life cycle. On the left is a swamp milkweed leaf beetle, obviously eating a milkweed, and on the right is a monarch butterfly. So you want to have leaf material, you want to have seeds, you want to have berries for different life moments. Another piece of the puzzle in terms of offering food is making sure that there are nectar sources for a variety of critters. So we know that butterflies, bees, and even birds will use nectar as a food source. So for food, it is seeds, it is berries, it's a variety of leaves, and it's flowers. Water can come in a couple different forms. Obviously, bird baths are great for birds bathing, but they're also great for getting water. Birds and mammals will go to the same types of water sources. The picture on the right has a rock in it, and the rock is in there because insects need shallower water. And this allows an insect to go to the edge of the rock and dip in and get some water without falling in and drowning. So you can turn your bird bath into both a bird bath and a place where insects can get water. So don't forget about water. I know that some folks are concerned about mosquitoes. In my space, I rinse out and I take a scrub brush and I scrub out the bird bath like once a week. The crows also like to dip food in there, which leaves some debris. So it needs to be cleaned. But I usually do mine about once a week. So, a place to raise young. In this case, I'm going to talk a little bit about birds first. You can purchase a number of different bird houses to put in your space. The interesting thing about bird houses, they come in different sizes and they come in different shapes. But the thing you really want to be conscious of is where you place it and the size of the hole. So, where you place it, you can do a little bit of research for different types of birds. For this one, this is a clay birdhouse that I've attached to a fence. I've also put it behind a shrub, so that hides the nest and allows for some safety and some security against predators. The size of the hole is also really important. I'll talk about that in a second. I think it's the next slide. So in this one, this is what's called a bird's nest gourd, and we grew this in our yard, in our vegetable patch, and then dried it, and then shellacked it so that it would last for a couple of seasons, and then we drilled the hole in it. And you can look online for guidance on the size of the hole that will attract a certain type of bird. Sparrows, for a moment, especially English sparrows, if you're not interested in supporting English sparrows, then you need a hole that's small enough to attract something like chickadees or wrens or smaller birds. So you can Google the size of the hole to drill into your homemade bird nesting box. Or you can also buy at a hardware store some rivets or something like that of a certain diameter so that you can make sure that the hole remains the correct size for the type of bird that you're trying to support. Birds make their own nests. I think we all know this. And in this case, you can see in the background, there's a gray catbird that's nested in one of my hedgerows. They will find supplies all over your yard if appropriate. You can see in here that this catbird's found some plastic. So they also use trash, which is a little disconcerting. The birds are using what's available. And so the catbird in this instance is using a hedgerow, which provides not only shelter, but a place to create a nest. Now, a word of not caution, but I guess a helpful tip about inviting nature in, especially nesting. Birds are nesting now and they will nest through July. In my space, I have a number of hedgerows. I know that the birds are nesting in because I've been watching and I can see them developing and creating their nests and coming in and out of that space, which means that I can't trim those hedges until almost August. So that's something to think about when you're inviting nature in. There's some give and take about how we expect our yards to look and how we might act in our yards, that we have to accommodate some of the things that are happening with nature in our yards. So in this case, I learned the hard way that the catbird had 2 nesting cycles and was nesting in July. That surprised me. I thought they were finished at the end of June. And so when I was trimming this hedgerow, I uncovered this nest, which is how I got this picture. I tried to put some of the branches back to help create some shelter, but unfortunately the crows then found it. So there's two cautionary tales here. One is you really need to pay attention to the nesting cycle. Be willing to let some of your plants go. Also, when you invite nature in, it's not always like the Cinderella story where the birds are chirping and everyone's happy and life goes on in this big, wonderful world. Tragedy happens, and that's just the cycle of life. But we learn from it, and we learn every time that we invite nature in about how we're all interconnected and what that interconnection looks like. So don't trim your shrubs until mid to late July, or look really very carefully. And that's your trees as well. You have to be very careful about when you do your pruning. So sometimes, of course, there are some birds that like nesting cavities. So this is a cherry tree in my yard that we kept that died, and this is the trunk. And we cut this off maybe at 3.5, maybe 4 feet. And there's a hole in the center of this picture, and that is where a chickadee created a nest. So they dug out and created this cavity and then put a nest in there. They're using the stump that we left for their nesting site. They'll also find creative places to put their nests. This is probably a house finch, and this is a hanging basket on my front porch. It's a fern. This makes it really difficult to water my plants when they decide that the basket in my front porch is the place where they're going to raise their young. So this plant suffered some, but there was a brood of house finches that were able to be successful in their life cycle because they were using the hanging basket on my front porch. So they're going to nest in a lot of places. When you invite them in, you might invite them closer to your house than you probably would have expected. And that's really exciting because then you can get up close and you can actually see how they're living their lives. I mentioned before that the catbird was getting nesting material from my yard. So one of the things that I like to do is keep the dried parts of the plants through the spring. This is mullygrass on the left-hand side, and I leave this in its dried form until the end of May. And on the right-hand side, it's not a native, but I leave this too. This is called Crocosmia. And so I leave the dried parts of the plants, both for the seed heads, so that the birds can eat throughout the winter and then even into the spring. And I leave the dried parts for them to use for nesting material, especially the grasses that I have in my yard. Let's talk about insects for a minute. You might have seen things like this. This is an insect house. Sometimes they're in square forms. They're called bee houses or insect houses. There's some pluses and minuses to having this type of structure in your yard. If you look towards the center of the picture, you can see a couple of places where there is some soil or some mud in there. That's where a solitary bee or wasp has used that hole to put in their eggs and raise their young. So it is being used to some extent. What can happen in here if it gets too crowded is it can spread disease. So if you think about it, a solitary bee or a solitary wasp is solitary for a reason. They're introverts, if you think about it like that. They want to be by themselves. And so being in a crowded space like this is not natural or normal for them. So it can spread disease. But in this case, you can see that that's not happening. So I'm not as concerned about it, but that's something you would need to look out for, to make sure that this is not overbuilt, if you will. So there are things like this that you can use to help solitary insects to raise young in your yard. Another thing that you can do is simply just to let the plants be those natural places for them. This is a plant called ironweed. And what I do with this plant is in fall, I will cut it down to about 3 feet. And what that does, especially for plants that have an open branching structure or open stem structure, once it's dried out for perennials, that creates a natural hole. It's the same hole that you just saw on that structure in your bee house. It's about the same size. So what I do is I cut down my perennials and leave these in place through the end of May, sometimes into June. And they do two things. They will place their eggs in here, but they'll also overwinter. Insects will overwinter in these spaces. So these are safe spaces for them to overwinter and to also raise their young. Again, thinking about it from this perspective, there are some trade-offs to inviting nature in. One of them is leaving your dried material in place through the spring. So it's a different kind of aesthetic. To me, it's beautiful because it tells me that I'm doing right by nature and I'm doing right by the critters that I'm inviting in. My neighbors might have a different opinion, but again, it's about building community. It's about an opportunity for me to be able to say to my neighbors, this is why I'm doing this, and this is the result of me leaving my yard looking like it does, which I think is beautiful. A lot of insects make their own homes. This is a potter wasp, and it makes what looks like a ceramic pot on the underside of a leaf. So as you're cleaning out your yard again in the spring, you just need to be mindful of the fact that when you invite nature in, you could be inviting this insect in to raise its young by creating this beautiful piece of pottery on the underside of your leaves. The last thing I wanted to talk about is leaving the leaves. This is a program that you may have heard about. It's really very simple. In the fall, when the leaves come down from your deciduous trees and shrubs, leave them in your garden space. What I do is I rake them off the grass and I rake it into my garden space. And when you leave the leaves, you are providing cover for overwintering insects, and you're providing nutrients for the next year because it will decompose into your soil. So providing food and shelter by leaving the leaves in your garden space, and they will decompose after about a year. There are some species that take a little bit longer. Sycamores will take a little bit longer, but they will decompose over time. And this year I experimented with this in my front yard, and I have grass paths that sort of wind through my garden space. And every once in a while, I just had to rake it back into the garden bed. But it worked really nicely. It decomposed and it had a nice leaf cover, which also helps keep down the weeds. Another thing I'd like to encourage you to do as your garden evolves is that when a tree dies, like this cherry tree in my yard, we cut down the stump to about 3 feet and then we left the stump. This provides food for detritivores. And of course, when you invite the insects in, you're inviting the birds. So the woodpeckers would come to this stump looking for the insects that are inside that stump. Leaving stumps in the yard is also an opportunity to invite nature in. Also, leaving sticks in your yard is a way of inviting nature in. You're providing cover for insects, which invites the birds in. If leaving sticks around feels sort of messy to you, there are creative ways to leave your sticks in your yard. I got inspired to do this from something I saw at the Smithsonian at the Natural History Museum in Washington, D.C., where they made giant nests out of yard material. So what I did was I collected the sticks in my yard, and my husband and I created a nest. And I did this right on the front of my property so that when people are walking down the sidewalk, they can see it. And it's a talking point where if I'm out gardening and someone says something, I can say, yes, I did the nest there because I think it's fun and creative, but I built the nest also because I'm leaving the sticks in my yard so that the detritivores have something to eat and that insects have a place for shelter and that the Carolina wren has a place to poke about looking for insects for food. These can be creative pieces and they can add some really beautiful elements to your yard and some real interest and things to talk about with your neighbors. I'm going to pause here for any questions about the basics.
We just got one, Amy. The question is, if you have a lot of leaves and don't want to smother more tender emerging plants, when would it be safe to rake some of them onto the lawn so the mower can shred them?
That's a good question. I know that there are people who do that first. If the leaves have fallen and you want to rake them into your yard, you can mow them in your grass and then rake them in. That's probably the better time because the insects have not begun to burrow in or use them. And then you can use your lawnmower on your grass to do that. The one cautionary tale I would say about that, and I'm going to show to you in a minute, is sometimes butterflies or moths will pupate on leaves and then sometimes they'll fall to the ground and they look like leaves. I'm going to show you a picture of that at the end. So I would just be a little bit more careful. There's no perfect way. Honestly, circle of life, folks. When you invite nature in, sometimes it doesn't always go as you planned. But I would say I would mow it early. The life cycle of a lot of insects is early spring to late spring. So if you're thinking, I'll put the leaves in there in the fall and then I'll wait. And then when things start to emerge in the spring, I'll bring them out. That's really the most disruptive time to bring your leaves out is in the spring. So the earlier you do it, the better. And first thing is probably the best time.
Okay, thanks. There's a corollary question here. Can the leaf layer be too deep for emerging spring plants?
Not really. However, what I did was I raked the leaves in and then I go in the spring and I pull them away from the plants. So, yes, it can be too deep. So, if you're thinking like 6 inches of leaves, that's a
Mhm.
problem. However, you can also move them away and they will flatten over time, which is interesting because there's an air pocket in there. When you first break them in, there's an air pocket and they will compress. And I would recommend that you move the leaves away. Keep in mind, when are the plants emerging? Just being mindful of the cycle of life through your garden. So you can pull them away. That's what I do.
One little question. You had mentioned you had a stump that was 3 feet high. Is it
Yep.
ever better to leave it taller?
You can leave them taller. I took out a picture I had in my presentation before. We left a tulip tree stump. I think we left it about 10 feet. And then we
Mhm.
invited an artist to carve it. And so we made a beautiful art piece out of it. And there are some people who do that and then they shellac it because they want the art piece to always be there. We took a different approach. We only shellacked it a little bit and then we just let it naturally decay. I'm okay with that kind of thing. We left it at 10 feet and then we did an artful thing to it. And then it's been really interesting to see who's living there, what's coming out of it. It's been fascinating the last 10 years. So tall is fine. There's no height restriction. If you only cut off part of it, it's just going to sucker. It's got to be dead.
One more question on stumps. Are low cavities like the one you showed for chickadees easy pickings for squirrels?
That's a good question. The squirrel that you should be concerned about is the southern flying squirrel. Flying squirrels, there are more flying squirrels than there are gray squirrels. You just don't see them because they're at night. They're nocturnal. Flying squirrels are the ones that are going to be raiding your nests. They are omnivores, but they will raid birds' nests. Not much you can do about that. And it doesn't matter the height, they're all over the tree canopy. I wouldn't worry about squirrels so much, it's the snakes. The snakes can climb that and they can get into the cavity. The tricky part about that cavity is they built the cavity and built the nest before I knew it. So I could have put a skirt around the bottom. You've probably seen those protective skirts around like bird feeders and things like that that keep the snakes from being able to climb up and over. It's a metal skirt. You can do that. But had I done that after they built the nest, they might have abandoned it. They're going to nest in cavities at different heights. That just happened to be the height of that particular cavity.
Okay, thank you. I think we can go on.
All right, getting to know your neighbors. I have a distinct feeling that everybody here on this talk today probably has things already in your yard. Because if you put plants in your yard, you're going to have insects and you're going to have birds. So there's probably something already in your yard. And I encourage you to start out your adventure inviting nature in by conducting a census. Just make a list of what you see in your yard. And there are two apps that I use that are helpful in listing everything that I have in my yard. The first one that I use is iNaturalist. I think that's a great resource for identifying and tracking the insects and birds, also plants, reptiles, amphibians, whatever you want to track. So iNaturalist is a great way to actually document everything that's in your yard and to keep track of it over time. So you could begin a list on iNaturalist today, and then over time, just watch your list grow as you discover more and more the things that are coming to your yard as you begin to put these things in place, the food, water, shelter, and place to raise young. As you begin to incorporate that into your yard, you can use iNaturalist to track what you're seeing as you go on this adventure. Another one that I use is eBird. The Cornell Ornithology Lab has an eBird app tracking birds. And there are a couple of citizen science programs that you can do also with Cornell, the Great Backyard Bird Count and the Christmas Bird Count, which is a way of also documenting what you've got. So those are two of the methods. There are other apps out there. We were talking about Seek earlier. Colleen was telling me about Picture This, which is another one that you can use to document the plants. So I would say start there and say, what do I have? And then build it over time. It's pretty surprising and pretty fun to see this list of things that are in your yard grow over time. So I want to talk about what you might be able to encounter in your yard as you begin to invite nature in. And yes, butterflies are charismatic mini fauna. Everybody wants butterflies in their yard. I do too. They're awesome. But I'm hoping in this next section of the talk that I'm going to get you to love flies. It's a high bar. I realize that for a lot of people, but I think I can do it. You're going to love flies by the end. We're going to see. So let's not cast dispersion to other things that we might have in our yards, that bees and wasps can be intimidating in your yard. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that means. But they are also beautiful. This four-toothed mason wasp, look at that coloring. So lovely. And they also make those really beautiful pottery for you. We also have heard a lot, probably in the news, about the issues around honeybees. And honeybees are important in the agricultural world, but I would argue that native bees are more important for those of us who have backyards or are inviting nature in. Bees are important, but I'd also like to advocate for the native bees and paying attention to the native bees. And I do realize that when people see images like this, they're like, oh my gosh, bees and wasps. This is really scary, although I would say that the guinea paper wasp is really beautiful. It has lovely coloring, and you'd be surprised that not all bees and wasps are aggressive. The guinea paper wasp, for example, is actually only aggressive if you really whack on its nest, which I don't recommend ever, and they're pretty docile as wasps go. But there are ways of also just seeing that there's beauty in this and some surprising things about bees and wasps. The reason I was able to take this picture is that the wasp here is actually feeding on what's called honeydew, which is what aphids excrete on a leaf. So this is a milkweed leaf that the aphids were on, and they left honeydew, and the wasp comes in, and that's what it's feeding on. So there's this really interesting story about what's going on in nature when you take a moment and you're able to see it and observe it. It really raises, I hope, a sense of respect for all of the critters that you're going to invite into your yard. But I'd also like to take a minute to sort of surprise you about what you might be seeing in your yard and get you more comfortable, especially in the insect world, which can be very intimidating. So this is the part of the talk where I'm hoping to get a little bit of participation from you. We're going to make it participatory. And we're going to start talking about what we're seeing in the yard and just making some simple observations. So when you look at this picture, if you could put into the chat some of the things that you're seeing, what do you see? And also, how does it make you feel to see something like this in your yard? So I'm going to give you a second to get your thoughts together, add an idea. There's no wrong answer because this is just what you see and what you feel. And if it helps to think about how to describe things in nature, one of the volunteers I had that worked with me in the past came up with a mnemonic called Scientists See Cool Things and Patterns. And what it stands for is size, shape, color, texture, and pattern. And those are the physical attributes that we're looking at when we're beginning to describe things that we see in nature. And when you invite nature in, it's an opportunity to make these observations and really see what's in front of you: size, shape, color, texture, and pattern. So what are some of the things that you're seeing?
Okay, we got a list here, Amy. I'll give you the whole list.
Okay.
Honeydew, syrphid fly, not a bee, two wings, beautiful iridescent wings, a fly cleverly masquerading as a bee, a hoverfly, and giant eyes.
Awesome. I love that. There's a fly expert here today. I feel it. The one person I don't have to convince to love flies. So this is what I would love to hear because I think this is going to be helpful for a second. So yes, it's a yellow-legged flower fly. So for those who thought it was a bee, I want to encourage you to look a little more closely. And for the person who knew that it was a fly, can you put in the chat two things that you're seeing that would help your colleagues here on the call to know that it's a fly? Two things that people can see. And I'm going to add things too if that's helpful. And for other folks to participate, you can also say, if you look at these two pictures, what are the things that are the same and what are the things that are different? Let's give that a whirl for a second so we can compare and contrast these two.
For your first question, the
Mhm.
person has weighed in with big fly eyes.
That's right. Big fly eyes. Yes.
And someone else has added more characteristics, huge eyes, central knobby antennae, only two wings, but that's sometimes hard to see.
Yes, that's excellent. I love it. Perfect. So when you're out in your yard, and I've had this experience myself where I go out and I'm waiting in my mint patch and it's covered in pollinators. And I think, oh my God, it's the bees. And I don't react well to bee and wasp stings. I'm not allergic, but I don't react well. And it does kind of freak me out a little bit, to be honest. And when you walk out there and you think, oh, look at it, because they're all yellow striped things. And then you're like, wait, let's take a look. Let's see what we really are seeing there. And the two things that were pointed out, there are three things: the wings, the eyes, and the antenna. Absolutely. The two that you're probably going to see more than anything are the eyes and the antenna. So if you look on the fly on the left, you see those big eyes, and that was a great description. The big eyes that are almost like goggles on the front. And then you've got these two little stumpy antennae on the front as well. But on the bee, the eyes are on the sides and they're more oval shaped, and those antennas stick out to the side. So when you're looking at them, you just focus on the eyes and focus on the antenna. Don't worry about the yellow stripes yet. And then you'll see, oh, is that a bee or is that a wasp or is it a fly? So that's a really cool way of looking at it. The wings, the person was right. It's really hard to see the wings because they're usually flying and they're in motion. But take a look at the eyes and then take a look at the antenna. So let's do another one because that was fun. What do we think is going on here? I'll take a minute. Remember what you're supposed to be looking for. What are we seeing here?
A response so far is a fly with a wasp waist, a narrow waist. Is it a wasp of some sort? And our original fly person says a fly.
This is great. All right. Cobalt hover fly. Yes. So you're right. So I love the fact that someone noticed it's got that waist, because when you're looking for wasps, of course, you're seeing that really thin waist, and that can be a little off-putting. But remember, it might not be a wasp. In this case, it's the cobalt hoverfly. Let's try another one.
And Amy, the last weigh-in was big eyes and knobby antennae.
I'm going to go back and show that. Yes. Do you see those big eyes and the little antenna on the top? Awesome. Good job, everybody. All right, let's try another one. What do we see here? Take a look. Scientists see cool things and patterns. What do we
Another
think?
vote for big eyes and knobby antennae.
Yes.
Another vote says big eyes suggest a fly.
Yep. These are great observations.
Big eyes, knobby antennae. So
Mm.
that's the second vote for that.
Yep. Good job. What I love about this one scared me, no doubt, until I saw the big eyes and the knobby antenna. It's an eastern hornet fly, because of course it looks like it's a hornet, not a fly. But you take a minute, these are little teeny things too. But what I love about this one is that even the eyes are striped. So does anybody know what the scientific concept that we're talking about right now, where the flies look like bees? Does anybody know that? If you go back in your Wayback Machine to environmental science, biology 101, can anybody remember what this topic is?
There are two answers for mimicry, and someone else put in, would size indicate a fly as bees can be much larger?
Great question. And yes, this is mimicry. So the flies are mimicking the bees, wasps, and hornets as a way of protecting themselves. Size, flies can be pretty big, bees can be really small. Bees can be teeny, teeny, teeny. So size won't help you with that one. Yeah, bees can be really small. I've got a bee photo later on with teeny, teeny bee that I took with a macro lens. So size doesn't help you. It's really the eyes and the antenna, first off. And then there's also the attachment of the wings and the number of wings, but that's harder to see. First, when you're thinking if it's a bee, you tend to stand back. I would focus on the eyes and the wings. So just to continue this love of flies, I'm feeling it from everybody that we're enjoying the flies more. There's some beautiful flies that you can find. These are all native, the golden-backed snipe fly. I mean, look at the yellow on that. You know, you just want to make a jacket out of it. And then the swift feather-legged fly got these really interesting little doodads on its legs, and it's a lovely orange color. So they don't all mimic. A lot of them do mimic. But these are beautiful flies, and they're doing their job. Their larva stage is a decomposer, if you will, and the adult is a pollinator. I think I've gotten you there. One, a couple messages. Not everything you see is a bee or a wasp. And so I know it can be scary to invite nature in if those are insects you're not comfortable with, but they're not always bees and wasps. And a great way to discern the two is to begin to use iNaturalist to identify them by taking pictures and loading it up into that app. I want to talk a minute about pollinators because I just mentioned that flies are important pollinators and that the ones that you were just seeing in those pictures were all pollinators. We often think about pollinators, bees, and they are. Bees are the most important pollinators, native species of bees, especially. There are 4,000 species in the United States. Flies, another reason to love flies, are the second most common pollinator. They're especially common in pollinating fruits and vegetables. Moths are the unsung heroes of pollination, mostly because they're at night and we don't see them. Of course, there are a lot of species of butterflies that pollinate, and butterflies are important too. And then just a note for beetles, because I love beetles as well. Beetles were among the first pollinators when you think of it evolutionarily. They pollinated some of the first flowering lineages like magnolia. So beetles were some of the first pollinators in terms of deep time. And then just because there are lots of beautiful insects out there. If you look, the critter on the left is one of the leaf hoppers. It's called a hirsute sharpshooter. It's like a superhero cape. I love the coloring on this thing, and it's a teeny, teeny little critter. They do eat your plants, but they won't kill them, but they do love eating your leaves. And they're important in terms of being food for birds, and they're beautiful. And of course, the eastern-eyed click beetle is a detritivore. So there are these beautiful insects and spiders out in your yard, as well as birds and other critters. And once you begin to create that habitat that invites them in, I think you'll be just blown away by the things that you can see once you begin to invite them in and take a look. All right, so let's start simple and make a plan. This takes time. I've been working in my space for more than 20 years, and gardens evolve, and as they evolve, you'll find different critters come and go. So it does take time. So patience, not my strong point, might be yours. Patience is an important aspect of creating habitat. I encourage you to start with a goal. It will help focus where you work in your yard or your space. It helps you to focus and start small and then build from there. So kind of goal might be, I want to see more butterflies, bees, and flies. I'd like to have birds year round. Find a goal, find something to focus your energy on. The basics, they're called the basics not because they're not important, but because you have to have them. Food, water, shelter, place to raise young. And then also do some research, and you can create a shopping list and get going. We'll have some resources at the end that can help you with that. That's a great way to start. So we're going to get started with a 4-season plan. In this next section, I'm going to offer some ideas of what you can have to invite nature in. And you might already have some of these plants, which would be great. And if you do, then I encourage you to start looking to see who's interacting with the plants in your yard, because you might be surprised at just how much you're already doing to invite nature in. I'm going to start with some trees. The numbers on the right for this list of trees, the numbers fluctuate, but basically these are the latest numbers I got from Doug Tallamy's research on how many species of Lepidoptera, of butterflies and moths, these trees attract or support. So just take a minute to think about that. Oak trees can support 534 species of Lepidoptera. So what that means is if you've got an oak, you're doing a great job already. It doesn't mean you're going to get all 534, so don't worry, I don't have to count all of them. It is a primer in terms of what is going to be attracting wildlife to your garden. It's also just a reinforcement about why native trees and shrubs and plants are going to attract more native wildlife to your yard. And that's really what I'm going to focus on here. Everything you see going forward is going to be native plants. So Take a look at the numbers. It's pretty amazing. Even pine trees, because we always think about attracting wildlife to use flowering plants, but pine trees are also really important. The pollen in pine trees attracts insects, which attracts the birds. The pollen in pine trees also attracts birds because birds eat pollen. And pine trees, because they are evergreen, are great places for shelter and also to build nests. So pines are also important. Other native trees that you can be thinking about, you probably already have a lot of these. Dogwoods are also excellent for wildlife, for both insects, for larvae, but also because they've got berries. So don't forget, trees and shrubs can be about the berries, the nuts, the leaves. They've got all that food, they've got all that shelter. They're really awesome things to have in your yard. Holly trees are especially awesome because their berries last late into the season, and they're a great late season food for birds. At the bottom of this list is a plant called pawpaw, which some people might have heard about. I've got asterisks next to some of the plants that are a little bit more challenging, but not impossible. For example, for pawpaw, you need two genetically different plants in order to get fruit. And the fruit of a pawpaw can attract raccoons, which I love, and squirrels will eat the fruit, raccoons will eat the fruit, possum, and they also attract a zebra swallowtail butterfly. Pawpaws are great, but they're a little bit of a challenge. Let's talk a little bit about shrubs. The shrubs I'm listing here do a couple of different things. They have berries, but they also are great pollinators, especially early in the season or in the summer. The two that have asterisks, viburnum and spicebush. Viburnum is the same as the pawpaw. You need genetically different ones in order to pollinate. And the spicebush has a male plant and a female plant. And you have to be really careful about that. You have to have two of them in order to get the berries. They'll both have flowers, but in order to get the berries, you need a male plant and a female plant. So there are some of these plants you have to be careful about if you want them, that you need to buy two of them, and you need to know one is a male and one is a female. Chokeberry is also a really great screening shrub, and it has a million berries on it, and it's a pollinator magnet, as is St. John's wort. Some other shrubs to be thoughtful of. These are also great for people. You can make jam out of elderberry. And as I said before, beautyberry is also something you can collect and make jam out of, but they're great for birds. New Jersey tea is also really great for butterflies, for the larval stage of the butterfly. And who doesn't like hazelnut? I'm going to take a moment to talk about grasses. So grasses are important for two things. They have a ton of seeds. Sparrows are especially attracted to grasses, both for feeding and for nesting. I like to have a large clump of grasses to provide that food source and also to provide nesting material as well as a space for nesting. And then there are surprisingly some butterflies that lay their eggs on grasses. So that's something to be thoughtful of as well. Plus, they're pretty beautiful, frankly. I'm going to go through some 4-season plant selections for herbaceous perennials. The dates in here are sort of relative. Sometimes you can get, especially with climate change, things a little bit earlier, things a little bit later, but I just sort of broke them off into relative timeframes. One thing to think about in terms of springtime perennials, a lot of this is about in the springtime getting nectar. What I encourage you to think about with pollinators and nectar feeding critters is to not only think about a variety of plants, but a variety of flower shapes. So in this picture, these are Virginia bluebells. You've got that tubular shape. That's something that a bee can fly into, land in, and then eat from that tubular shape. It's not as good for butterflies, but it's great for bees. Bees, flies, wasps, etc. So think about the shape as well as the season for pollinators. I didn't put anything earlier than March. In my yard, I struggle with native plants that come out and flower earlier than March. What I rely on in mine are crocuses for those January, February moments, especially when we have some of those crazy days when it gets above 50 or 60 in January and February. I'm relying on my crocuses. I'm still thinking about how to bring some earlier bloomers in there. So if you have suggestions for things before March, please feel free to put them in the chat, especially if they're native. I would encourage you to do native ones. But right now I'm relying on crocuses. So here's some options. Golden ragwort is a wonderful one. It spreads. Some of these, if you want them, you got to really want them because they're hard to get rid of, even though they're native. So this is another example on the right of golden alexander, and notice how the plant has a different shape. This is the type of plant shape that would encourage a butterfly to land on it because their wings are so big, right? They can't fold them up and then scooch into that tubular one. So having flowers that have an open shape will encourage pollinators to land on top of them. So here's a list of plants that are not only good for pollinators, but May apples, the apple, the actual fruit of that, is something that turtles eat. So you could be feeding turtles by having May apples in your yard. Also, these are different shaped flowers that you can encourage different types of pollinators. The golden alexander, I think, is the black swallowtail, which lays its eggs on that plant in particular. So when we come into the summer, again, we're still thinking about flowers for the pollinators, but we're also thinking about larval plant sources. And milkweeds is, of course, one of those we should all know about for monarch butterflies. But here are some plants that not only feed butterflies, flies, wasps, etc., but can also attract birds. Bee balm is an awesome plant for pollinators, and it is in the mint family. And if you don't know this already about mints, mints can spread. Mountain mints are also another one that can spread, but they are really great for pollinators. The one on the right is called liatris. And again, when you think about your flowers, we've seen a tubular shaped flower, we've seen a flat headed flower, and then you see a spike flower. And so these are just different forms that allow for different pollinators to take advantage of them. A bonus for anybody who wants to put into the chat what kind of critter is on this flower, based on what we were talking about earlier before. But also, again, think about the flowers that you have even late into the summer, June through August. Some great ones that are natives, any kind of Rudbeckia, any kind of Coreopsis is wonderful. The cardinal flower, of course, is something that attracts hummingbirds. And then there's another plant in here I've talked about before, which is ironweed. And that was the one where I showed you that if you cut it off, it's got a tube and the insects can overwinter as well as lay their eggs there. Did you have an answer, Colleen, for
We
what
had two, hornet fly and fly.
flies? Yes, it's a fly. Isn't that beautiful? See, loving
Yes.
flies. I feel it. I feel the love for the flies already.
Can I also ask you a question that came up?
Sure.
It says, could you remind them, are certain bee balms better than others, for instance, by color?
There are insects and birds that are attracted to some colors more so, not exclusively, than others. So you're going to get your hummingbirds who are attracted to bright colors like oranges and reds. And then you can have your butterflies that are attracted to blues and yellows and reds. I've seen flies on everything, frankly. They're going all over the place. So there are some attractors, though they're not exclusive. I want to talk a minute about specialists versus generalists. Ironweed is a plant that attracts a particular bee and is called the denticulate long-horned bee. Just like a milkweed attracts a monarch, there are some plants that an insect will almost only go to. The monarch will only lay its eggs on milkweed, and the denticulate longhorn bee will come for the pollen on an ironweed. So there's two messages in this. One is if you plant ironweed, you're going to get that insect because it has a relationship to that plant. If you plant milkweed, you will get monarchs because there's a relationship to that. Those are specialists. They're generalists who will go to anything. Flies, a lot of butterflies will go to just about anything except monarchs, of course. So once you take the ironweed away, you'll likely not see that insect anymore. If you put something in there that is for specialists, it's interesting to then see, do you actually get that specialist insect or bird or critter come to that plant? And it's something to consider when you're putting plants in. So I have seen the denticulate longhorn beetle in my yard because I have ironweed. This is one of the pictures of a teeny, teeny little bee. It's just a little teeny thing. When we talked about before with the question of whether or not size makes a difference between whether it is a fly or a bee, the answer is no. So here's a really teeny, teeny little bee. In the fall, this is like the last gasp for insects and migrating birds. It's so important to have food out in the fall as birds are migrating through and as insects are filling up to either overwinter or pack their nests with food for emerging larvae in the spring. Asters are just the bomb when it comes to pollinators. Asters as a plant often have a ton of flowers, and they're what are called composites. So I'm going to go back a page for a second because this is a better picture. The flower in this picture is called a composite. This is not a flower. This is many flowers. So the petals are actually ringing the flowers. Where the bee is, there's 50 flowers in there. Each one of those little teeny bits is the flower. And the whole thing is called an inflorescence. So composites, like sunflowers, let's go back to this other one, like asters, are actually many, many flowers. So they hold a lot of energy and a lot of food just in that one plant and that one flower. So in the fall, having things like goldenrod, asters, joe pye, sunflowers, these are plants with tons and tons of flowers and tons of food to them. The turtlehead and the obedient plant are also flowers that have different shapes, which is helpful, again, for those different shapes. There's also a climbing aster that is a vine. Mine in my yard blooms into December, and it's always covered with stuff. So think about that in the fall. It's just like put things in that'll bloom that are packed with energy. I want to talk a little bit about vines. I love vines. It's a lovely structure, it brings height. Vines are a form that can become unwieldy. So if you want vines, you got to want vines. A couple that I've mentioned that are native, the one in the picture that's called bignonia, also called crossvine. It's a lovely red and yellow flower. Honeysuckle is awesome. There is a native one. Be careful that you're getting the native one and not the Japanese one. Virginia creeper. I think some people sort of poo-poo Virginia creeper. It supports a couple of moths, a sphinx moth. And if you put it in a sunny spot, it's a beautiful burgundy in the fall. But it does support wildlife. Passion flower also does support wildlife. I have it in my yard as an accident. I don't know how it got there, but it's there and it pops up everywhere. So if you want purple passion flower, put it in a pot or live with the fact that it's going to love your yard and show up in lots of different places. But it's a great pollinator and it's a very cool flower. What to avoid? A couple of things to avoid, and these are things that I'm also struggling with in my yard. I have no perfect yard, that's for sure. The Audubon Society and a lot of naturalist societies, as well as research, talk a lot about how cats roaming free outdoors are doing a great deal of harm to birds. This is nothing against cat owners, but knowing that cats are one of the primary reasons for the decline of birds. Climate change, habitat destruction, colliding with buildings are all reasons that birds are in decline, and cats are also another one. So letting cats outside to roam free, especially in nesting season, is going to bring down the wildlife in your yard. Spraying insecticides is going to do the same thing. When you see someone who says, I'm going to spray for mosquitoes, there's no such thing. You're spraying for everything. The insecticides that kill mosquitoes kill everything. So your fireflies, your larvae, your butterflies, your flies, your bees, your wasps, it kills everything. Again, these are trade-offs that we have in our yards. When we think about inviting wildlife in, we want to sustain it. And there's certain things that are working against inviting and against sustaining it. Having large unadorned glassed windows are also an issue for birds because they're going to fly in and they're going to hit them. Planting or keeping natives. Planting natives, at this point, you really should be doing your homework on whether or not the plants you're putting in your yard are good for the environment, not buying natives. And then if you have them, to do your best to get them out. The picture on the right is my latest nightmare. It was something that appeared in my yard. There are two things. The taller plant is called Italian arum. If you see this in your yard, get on it immediately because this is a challenge. It's an invasive plant in Virginia, and it is really difficult to get rid of. And then vinca is also another invasive plant. So we all have them, or maybe you don't and you're lucky, but I have them. And it's just something that I am aware of. The Italian arum has a beautiful flower. It looks like a peace lily, if you know that indoor plant, and lovely red berries that the birds love. So yes, you're feeding the birds, but you can feed the birds with a native plant and not that one. This is how it got into my yard. Bright lights at night are also a challenge for birds and also for night insects, like a lot of moths. Having a dark yard is better for your wildlife that you're inviting in. And then again, I think we all have heard this before, but large stretches of lawn that are a monoculture are really a challenge. If you want lawn and need lawn, I would ask you to consider using a mixed lawn of clover and violets that can at least provide some ecosystem service if you're going to have lawn space in there. There are ways to have lawn that provide services for your ecosystem there. So that's what to avoid.
I don't know if you want to comment on it, but someone added pipevine to your list of vines.
Pipevine is awesome. That's a great plant because it attracts the pipevine swallowtail. I'm jealous. My neighbor has it, and I'm trying to find a way to put that in there because that's a great plant for the pipevine swallowtail. That's also an example of a specialist. The pipevine is going to lay its eggs on that. The larvae are a little intimidating, but beautiful. And of course, the butterflies are great. That's a great suggestion. Thanks for adding that. All right, so what does it look like to invite nature in? It's going to look different to everybody because we all see our yards through our own personal lens. But when I think about it, inviting nature in, one of the things I think about is in springtime when the plants are just emerging. It's an exciting moment to start thinking about what's coming alive and what I'm going to be able to see. And so these are May apples that are just popping out of the mulch and the leaves in my garden. Inviting nature in, we talked about leaving some stumps and trying to find beautiful ways of having things like stumps in your yard. And so to me, inviting nature in is having that balance of beauty, stumps and flowers together. It's also to me about seeing the beautiful critters that are coming in and looking to see who's here today, who's here this spring, who's new, who haven't I seen before that I'm inviting in. This is a fiery skipper that's on an ironweed. And that's actually a really good picture to show how one flower is actually multiple flowers. So that's a composite. So inviting nature in is about seeing beauty in lots of different ways. It's also finding things in an unexpected way. So on the left-hand side, that is some kind of sphinx moth cocoon. It looks like leaves. And so when I was pruning winterberry, I stopped for a moment because I thought, wait a minute, that's a weird looking leaf. And I almost trimmed it until I lifted it up and said, actually, that's a cocoon. And so a moth made a cocoon by wrapping those leaves together and is inside that. And so the excitement of saying in the spring, as long as the predator doesn't get it, I'm going to have this beautiful moth. And it came and chose my yard. And on the right-hand side, I was pruning a climbing hydrangea, which is not native, that was climbing up my chimney, and I didn't see it, but there it was hidden in the chimney. So I have tree frogs, and I didn't know I had it until I had my face up against the chimney, and then this frog appears out of nowhere. So it's finding things in unexpected places and taking the time to look and really to discover what do you have in your yard. And sometimes you're not going to see it. In the wintertime, a fox went through my yard. It chose the path, which I was appreciative of. It was using the path I made, but I'm finding footprints. I can tell you I have raccoons, not because I've ever seen one, but because I've seen their footprints. And then on the right, it's about knowing that a yellow-bellied sapsucker, which is a bird, is using the oak tree as a food source. And so those holes tell me that it's been there. And it tells me that it was pecking the holes so that the sap comes out, attracts the insects, and it eats the insects. I've never seen it, but I know that it's in my yard because it's leaving its mark that it chose my yard for a food source. And so you can wax philosophical and you can wax artfully about what it means to invite nature in. You can also be a nerd like me and you can actually just document it. And so by the numbers, these are the kinds of things that we've attracted in our space over the years with a diversity of plants and having the basics and avoiding things that are counter to what supports wildlife. So the mammals and the insects and the birds and the reptiles, one snake, one frog. I'm not excited about the snake, but I'll live with it. I am excited about the frog. And then just being able to slowly bring in more and more native plants and avoiding the invasive plants. So there's some resources. I think they're going to be up on the website. There are 2 books by Doug Tallamy that I think could be of interest to you. And there's also some citizen science websites that I've talked about already. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology and eBird for bird counts. iNaturalist is another one. And then if you're interested in adding native plants, at least for the Northern Virginia, Washington metropolitan area, Plant Nova Natives is a great resource. And they have a wonderful resource for native plants. It's basically a shopping list, frankly. And then, of course, Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia have a great website with resources for you to look through, as well as the National Wildlife Federation. So those are just some ideas for places to look for resources.
Thank you so much for really a great presentation.
Okay, thank you so much.